When we read the Qur'an and Islamic history, something very interesting comes up. In the early days of Islam, particularly during the Makkah period, we don't find much direct mention of Jewish communities in the Prophet's life and teachings. The moment the Prophet and his followers arrive in Medina,
welcome to the city of Medina the Blessed, your city, messenger of God.
The historical landscape changes completely. That there were already well-established Jewish communities living there. Why were there so many Jews in Medina? What brought them to this particular city in Arabia? According to Islamic and Jewish historical records, the Jewish people had been expecting a prophet to arrive. Not just any prophet, but specifically one who would come to Arabia. This expectation was rooted in their ancient texts and prophecies. Around 1,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad was born, the Jewish people understood from their scriptures that a messenger would come. So what did they do? Jewish tribes began migrating from Palestine toward Arabia. They settled in various places, but particularly in and around Medina. The largest concentration of these Jewish tribes eventually made their fortress in Kaabah, which was near Medina. Some sources tell us that before the Prophet even sent anyone to preach in Medina, the people of Medina already knew that a prophet was coming. Why? Because the Jewish communities living among them had been telling them repeatedly, "Soon our prophet will come. When he does, we will not forgive you for how you've treated us." By the time a messenger actually came from Mecca to announce that a prophet had appeared, the people of Medina's reaction was immediate and powerful. When Musab ibn Umair came from Mecca and said, "There is an Arab prophet in Mecca," the people of Medina didn't hesitate. They were the first people to embrace Islam, not because they understood the theology perfectly, but because they recognized the fulfillment of what they had been waiting for. Here's where the story becomes complicated and quite tragic. Despite all this knowledge and preparation, when the Jewish communities of Medina discovered that the Prophet was indeed an Arab, many of them rejected him. They had expected a prophet, they had prophecies about him, but when he came from Arabia instead of from their own people, they couldn't accept it. Some Jewish scholars did convert and became devoted Muslims. They even contributed to Islamic scholarship. But many others opposed the Prophet. This opposition led to conflicts, particularly the Battle of Kaabah, which fundamentally changed the political landscape of Arabia. One of the most fascinating discoveries of the 20th century was made in the mountains of Palestine. Old manuscripts were found in caves, some of the oldest copies of biblical texts ever discovered. These manuscripts, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, became incredibly important for understanding ancient religious texts. When scholars examined these ancient documents, they found something remarkable. These texts were thousands of years old. Some of them dated back at least 2,200 years. This made them some of the oldest surviving copies of the Torah in existence. For Muslims, this discovery is significant because it validates what the Qur'an tells us. The Qur'an says, "Indeed, it is we who have sent down the Qur'an, and indeed, we will be its guardian." When scholars read these ancient texts carefully, they discovered something interesting. Among these ancient documents, there were prophecies about future events, and some of these prophecies seem to align with what we know from Islamic history. One such prophecy mentioned a prophet who would come to Arabia. The text described how people in a place called Kedar, understood to be Arabia, would rejoice when this prophet appeared. It mentioned how people would climb mountains and shout in celebration. For Islamic scholars and historians, this is fascinating because it suggests that the expectation of a prophet was not just an Islamic belief, but was actually recorded in ancient Jewish texts centuries before the Prophet Muhammad was born. One of the most important sites in Islam is the Kaaba in Mecca. Muslims around the world turn toward it when they pray. Millions of Muslims make the pilgrimage to visit it. But there's something remarkable that many people don't know. When we read the book of Psalms, which is part of the Jewish scriptures, we find a very specific description. Psalm 84 describes a holy place where people worship God. It says, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. Those who go to the valley of Bakkah make it a place of springs. They go from strength to strength." Now Bakkah or Bakkah, this is what Makkah was called in ancient times. the valley mentioned, the water spring, the mountains that pilgrims climb between. These are geographical features that are found specifically in Mecca. What's remarkable is that even though Jewish and Christian traditions center much of their sacred geography around Jerusalem, their own ancient texts also acknowledge a holy place in Arabia. The Qur'an makes this clear in chapter Al-Imran. Indeed, the first house set up for mankind was at Bakkah, blessed and a guidance for the worlds. So we have ancient Jewish texts mentioning a sacred place in Arabia. The Qur'an affirming this same place. Historical records showing that Prophet Abraham built the Kaaba, continuous tradition of pilgrimage for thousands of years. Why the change of direction? Here's an interesting historical detail. When the Prophet first started preaching in Medina, Muslims used to pray in the direction of Jerusalem, toward the Baytul Muqaddas. But then, during a prayer in Medina, the Prophet received a command from Allah to change the direction. Instead of facing Jerusalem, Muslims would now face the Kaaba in Mecca. The companions who were praying with him immediately turned, and this became the new direction of prayer for all Muslims. Some people, particularly the Jews of Madina, questioned this change. They asked, "Why did you abandon the direction toward the holy house in Jerusalem?" The answer, from an Islamic perspective, is that Muslims weren't abandoning anything. Rather, they were returning to the original direction, to the house that Prophet Abraham had built thousands of years before the temple in Jerusalem was even constructed. The most difficult time. If you were to ask, when did the Prophet face his greatest challenges? The answer would be during the Makkah period, before he migrated to Medina. This was a time of intense persecution, loss, and isolation. The Prophet had lost the two most important people in his life, his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib. He had been physically attacked in the city of Taif until his shoes were filled with blood, and he had been stripped of his citizenship in Makkah. He was living under the protection of other tribes, not welcomed in his own city. It was during this darkest period that something extraordinary happened. One night in Makkah, the Prophet was visited by the angel Gabriel. Gabriel took him on a creature called Burak. The word comes from Barq, meaning lightning, which traveled at incredible speed. In a single night, the Prophet traveled from Makkah to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem through the seven heavens, and back to Makkah. Along this journey, he met previous prophets, Adam, Jesus, Joseph, Idris, Aaron, Moses, and finally, his great-great-grandfather Abraham. Each of these prophets had come in their own time, to their own people, with their own message, but they all represented the same core truth, that God is one and He sends guidance to humanity. The purpose of this journey, there was profound purpose behind it. At the end of this journey, in the presence of Allah, the Prophet received the greatest command in Islam, the establishment of prayer, Salah, as a fundamental pillar of faith. The Quran records that the Prophet was initially commanded to pray 50 times a day. Moses, when he heard this, told the Prophet, "Your people will never be able to do this. Go back and ask Allah to reduce the number." Through a series of negotiations with Allah and with Moses advising the Prophet each time, the requirement was gradually reduced. 50 became 40, 40 became 30, 30 became 20, 20 became 10, and finally, it settled at 5. Even then, Moses said, "Your people still cannot do 5. But the Prophet replied, "I feel too shy to ask Allah again. 5 prayers I am content with." Understanding through modern science. Now you might wonder, how could all of this happen in one night? It's a reasonable question. If we consider modern physics, particularly Einstein's theory of relativity, we understand that time is not absolute. When an object moves at high speed relative to a stationary observer, time moves differently for each of them. For the Prophet traveling on Burak at what was described as lightning speed, time would have passed differently than for the people sleeping in Makkah. What felt like a long journey for the Prophet would have been just a few hours for everyone else. When the Prophet returned to Makkah and told people what had happened, the reaction was mixed. Some people, particularly Abu Bakr, the first caliph, immediately believed him. Abu Bakr was so confident in the Prophet that he earned the title As-Siddiq, the truthful, because of his unwavering faith. But others mocked the Prophet. They asked him detailed questions about Jerusalem, hoping to catch him in a lie. But the Prophet answered every question accurately, because he had actually been there. Some even asked him about a caravan that had gotten lost on the road. The Prophet told them exactly which caravan it was, and sure enough, a little while later, that caravan arrived and confirmed his account. Have you ever noticed how much of creation moves in circles? In our solar system, planets orbit the sun. The sun itself orbits around a supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy. Galaxies cluster together and orbit around something even larger. And at the atomic level, electrons orbit around a nucleus. This circular motion isn't random. It's fundamental to how the universe is structured. Everything in existence seems to be in some form of circular motion around something else. What the Quran says in chapter 2 to Al-Hajj of the Quran, Allah says something fascinating. Have you not seen that to Allah prostrates everyone in the heavens and the earth, and the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the trees, the animals? Now, this doesn't mean these things literally bow down like humans do in prayer. Rather, it's saying that everything follows the laws and patterns that Allah has set. Everything moves according to divine order. The spiritual meaning of circling the Kaaba. When Muslims perform Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the most important rituals is Tawaf, circling the Kaaba 7 times. What's remarkable is that when Muslims do Tawaf, they're not just doing a physical action, they're aligning themselves with a pattern that runs through all of creation. Think about it. The electrons in your body are orbiting around nuclei. The atoms in your body are part of a large organism. Your life is part of a larger community. Your community is part of a larger world. And the whole world is moving in patterns set by Allah. When you perform Tawaf, you're participating in the same circular motion that defines the universe. You're submitting to the same order that governs creation. You're affirming your place in a cosmos that revolves around the divine will. But there's another beautiful aspect to Tawaf. When millions of Muslims come to Makkah and circle the Kaaba together, they're demonstrating unity in a way that's hard to describe. They come from different countries, different cultures, different economic backgrounds. But in Ihram, the simple white clothing, they're all equal. They're all moving in the same direction, at the same pace, for the same purpose. This is what the Quran describes as believers who have truly understood their faith. They've moved beyond individual pursuits and individual desires. They've aligned themselves with something larger than themselves. To understand early Islamic history, we need to understand what was happening in the world at that time. Imagine the most powerful conflict happening on earth today. 2 superpowers facing off. Every other nation watching to see who will emerge victorious. That's what was happening in the 600 CE between the Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, and the Persian Empire. For centuries, Rome had been the dominant superpower. Its influence spread across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. But in the early 600 EPS, the Persian Empire launched a massive military campaign against Rome. Rome on the brink of collapse. From a strategic perspective, Rome was losing badly. The Persians had captured some of Rome's most important territories: Egypt, Syria, Palestine. They had even come close to capturing Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire itself. People around the world were betting that Rome would fall. It seemed logically impossible for Rome to recover. The Persian Empire was too strong, too organized, too militarily superior. But then something remarkable happened. Emperor Heraclius managed to reorganize the Roman forces. With support from the Pope in Rome and resources gathered from across Europe, he launched a counteroffensive. Against all odds, Heraclius pushed back the Persian armies. He recaptured the territories that had been lost. He even destroyed the sacred fire temple of the Persians, their most holy religious site. The Qur'an actually predicted this outcome. In chapter 3, the verses say, "The Romans have been defeated in a nearby land, but after their defeat, they will soon be victorious, within a few years." Now consider the context. Rome was losing. Everyone thought Rome would fall. It seemed impossible that Rome would win, yet the Qur'an said they will win. And not only that, the Qur'an added, "And on that day, the believers, Muslims, will also rejoice." The Prophet Muhammad spoke about many things that would happen after his time. These are called signs of the Day of Judgment, Ashrat as-Sa'ah. The Prophet mentioned several things. One of them was particularly interesting. When barefoot, poor shepherds will compete with one another in building tall buildings. Who were these shepherds? In Arabian culture, the Bedouins, Bedous, were nomadic tribes who lived in the desert. They had no permanent homes, moved constantly with their animals, were among the poorest people in Arabia, had little formal education, lived on the margins of Arab society. But something remarkable happened in the 20th century. In the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in what is now Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, vast oil reserves were discovered. This oil wealth transformed entire regions overnight. The Bedouin tribes, who had lived in poverty for millennia, suddenly became extremely wealthy. Their descendants became billionaires and major investors. And what did they do with this wealth? They began constructing some of the world's tallest buildings. In Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, who comes from a Bedouin tribe, directed the construction of the Burj Khalifa, one of the world's tallest buildings. In Saudi Arabia, billionaires from similar backgrounds are building the Kingdom Tower, which will be even taller. And other Arab nations are announcing even taller projects. It's a competition, exactly as the Hadith described. Barefoot, poor shepherds competing with one another in building tall buildings. Now, this is where we need to be careful with our interpretation. The Hadith mentions this as a sign, one of many signs of the approach of the final hour. But recognizing a sign doesn't mean we can say with certainty that the final hour is imminent. The Qur'an is clear that only Allah knows when that will be. They ask you about the hour, say, the knowledge of it is only with Allah. Quran 33 to 63. What we can say is, 1. The Hadith describes a scenario. 2. That scenario seems to be unfolding in our time. 3. We should take it seriously as a spiritual reminder. 4. We should increase our good deeds and moral awareness.